Hello guys and welcome back. Today we got a special video on our hands today talking about one player from every team that should be traded at the deadline this year. And with the deadline just a month away, Bleacher Report just released an article talking about one player from every team. We're going to be going through all of it to see what I agree, what I disagree with, and what I think could happen at the deadline this year. So make sure you watch till the end for all the rankings and all the latest trade rumors, and hit that subscribe button if you're new for more hockey content and trade content just like this all year round. Now, coming up, we're going to see which player from your favorite NHL team could be dealt this year. But first, let's talk about today's sponsor in BetUS. BetUS is a place to make daily NHL and sports bets in both the US and Canada. And they got some great offers and 125% bonus on your first 3 deposits if you use the code JOIN125 in the description with a link, as well as 24/7 customer service and payouts. For today's NHL action, I have a couple of picks here. I'm first going to go Montreal plus 120. Pretty good odds from the win versus Buffalo. Even though they've had some streakiness, I think they could get it done today. I also like Boston versus Edmonton. The Oilers have been kind of streaky as of late. Same thing with the Bruins, but they've got a little bit of momentum going, so we'll see how it goes. Putting $10 down, seeing what happens here. Plus, as always with BetUS, if you want to make any bets any day on any of the big trophy awards, if you want to make any bets on any team winning the Stanley Cup, if you're feeling somebody special on any given day, you can do that as well. But of course, go to the description, click on the link, and make sure you bet with BetUS. And thank you so much to BetUS for sponsoring today's video. But let's get started here today from an article by Adam Gretz talking about one player from every team that should be shopped at the 2024 deadline. And this one had some really interesting picks that we're going to be going through, seeing what I agree with, seeing what I disagree with, and for your favorite team who I think they should ultimately trade. Now, starting us out here with the Anaheim Ducks is Adam Henrique, who, if you guys watched my 15 players that I think will be traded at the deadline video a few days back, you would know that Henrique, to me, is the most likely player to be dealt at the deadline. And for Anaheim, it makes a ton of sense why they would shop him, why they'd want him gone, and why they get a pretty big haul for him. Even though he's cooled back down a little bit, Adam Henrique can still bring a lot at 34 years old, and this year in 54 games for Anaheim has 36 points. He's a guy that's going to be really interesting if he goes to a true contender, likely more as a third line center than a true top 6 piece, but still Henry can provide a lot of value no matter where he ends up going. We start getting into the spicy ones here. Next up, though, the Arrows and the Coyotes, and interestingly, Adam ends up suggesting Matt Dumba as the trade piece here, saying how they shouldn't have a total fire sale, but some of their pending UFAs will be dingled out there, and Matt Dumba should be at the top of that list. Now, Adam ends up suggesting that he's exactly the type of player GMs love to trade for a second-round pick, but there is no chance in heck that Dumba is able to get a second-round pick back, maybe a third. And even though he's been playing better as of late offensively, he's gotten, I think, 4 points in his last 5. He still has 9 over the course of the season. And obviously, defensively, Matt Dumba isn't too sparkly clean either. So I think for Arizona, if they're able to get a third, they should take that. Now, Adam ends up mentioning Jake DeBrusk for the Boston Bruins, and the reasoning is pretty interesting regarding them getting rid of some salary cap, also them being a top team in terms of goals against, but some of that being because of the goaltending helping them out in a major way, potentially flipping DeBrusk for a more defensive piece, which I could completely understand. In Jake DeBrusk's case, he's been fine this year after having a great season in 2023, getting 25 points, 54 games, and maybe getting that cap off the books could be interesting. I also wouldn't be surprised if maybe another NHL right now like Jacob Luco is a part of getting a bigger piece back. Then we go into the Buffalo Sabres, and of course, Casey Mittelstadt has to be the one mentioned here because why the heck not? In terms of the Buffalo Sabres, they don't need to trade Casey Mittelstadt. I would agree with that. But again, considering his contract situation, we might have to see a resolution to this whole thing. To me, if I'm Buffalo, I'm looking at players with term at this year's deadline. Regardless of a Casey Mittelstadt trade, to me, I think they should still be active in acquiring players. They aren't a buyer for this year, but they should be buyers for next season. And if they're able to trade a couple of prospects for a massive piece on the defense or a defensive piece in the forward group, they should do it. Now we go into the Calgary Flames, and Adam mentions Jacob Markstrom. We haven't talked about Markstrom too much on the channel besides that 15 players that will be traded at the deadline video, but considering how much steam we've seen regarding New Jersey and Markstrom, a trade might happen sooner than later. But now that we know that Noah Hanifin might not re-sign with the Calgary Flames in the offseason, that becomes their #1 priority. With Jacob Markstrom, you still have some term, you'll still be solid. With Hanifin, you need to get a haul for him while you can, because if you're Calgary, you cannot lose this guy in free agency. Next up for the Carolina Hurricanes is Tony DeAngelo. This makes a ton of sense. He hasn't really played too much this year. When he has played, he's kind of been booty for Carolina. I would not be surprised if he's just kind of a roster move to get rid of. Now going on to the Chicago Blackhawks, Adam mentions Tyler Johnson, and this is one that I think has been kind of underrated in this trade deadline process. Johnson is a guy that this year has actually been pretty quietly solid, and I think could be a pretty interesting veteran to bring on if you're a contender. Now, Johnson this season hasn't been anything special, but considering what he's been able to do in Chicago the past couple of years and how he has 4 points over his last 5, there might be some momentum heading towards maybe a third-round pick going back to Chicago. It wouldn't be that much. Now we're getting into some more spicy ones here. Colorado and Bowen Byram. And Byram's name has kind of been floated out there a little bit. We saw him kind of floated out there in a potential Trevor Zegras deal, though that's definitely not happening. But Byram being dealt will be fascinating, especially considering how good he's been lately. I don't know if Colorado is going to trade him now, especially with how solid he's been and finally looking a little bit healthy, but we'll see. I still think if you're going to trade any D, it should absolutely be Samuel Girard, who makes $5 million, and that might be the reason why he hasn't been dealt compared to a Bowen Byram. It might get more interest as a younger, less cost or more cost-effective piece. But in Girard's case, he can still put up a lot offensively. He's still a great skating D, and I still think can provide value out there. But again, I think for Colorado, if you're going to trade any D for a forward, I think Girard will be the best bet out there. Plus for Byram, he's going to get better, and if he stays healthy, I think he'll be able to replace Girard in no time. Next up with the Columbus Blue Jackets, they mentioned Jack Roslovic. This makes a ton of sense, but also for Columbus, they have a wide range of guys they could trade to potentially make a splash, but Roslovic probably makes the most sense. As Adam mentions, he is a pending unrestricted free agent and might have some value to a contender as a depth forward, and even though he is a little bit costly at his current cap deal, maybe you have some retention there and you bring Roslovic in as a decent two-way forward. Again, I wouldn't expect him to be much more than depth, but for Columbus, they're probably just going to get a second-round pick and just leave it at that. Now, this one is interesting. On my favorite team, Adam says Craig Smith. Now, this one was kind of unexpected. He says the purpose of shopping Craig Smith wouldn't be to get a major return, but to basically essentially open up a roster spot for somebody else. Now, to me, I'm not really sure how much I agree with this. Craig Smith, I think, has been very solid for Dallas in a fourth-line role, 11 points, 52 games, and defensively has gone a lot better than he had been in the past for the Stars. So even though he makes $1 million and could shed some cap, maybe be part of the larger deal, I'm not quite sure about that. To me, maybe something that's more likely if the Stars are going to be an upgrading piece, bringing in is maybe a Ty Dellandrea, who has been pretty disappointing this season and could be more of a depth piece going back to somebody. Now, this one is pretty wild. The Detroit Red Wings pick is Ben Sherratt, who obviously was a big free agent signing for Detroit, but would be interesting. We've been talking about for Detroit how they might want to maybe change up a little bit of that depth, maybe bring in a different player and trade somebody else. Ben Sherratt would be a wild one to deal. Now, here's the thing. If this was last year, then I'd be like, oh, sure, this is a wild pick, but I kind of agree. But this year, Ben Sherratt has actually been pretty good, and I never really thought I would say that, but he actually has been. He's been pretty reliable for Detroit, has played some big minutes, and defensively has put up solid results, and I'm going to give the credit where it's due. I don't think they should trade him. To me, if you're going to look at other players to trade on that defense for Detroit, maybe a player like Ali Mata maybe fits that bill more, or a Jeff Petrie, who just have not been as impressive to me. Now, for the Oilers, his pick ends up being Brett Kulak. He did mention how he didn't want to include any prospects not on the roster, so Philip Broberg probably would have been the obvious choice here. Kulak would be interesting, but I feel like for Edmonton, having that depth would still be pretty important. He does mention how Cody Ceci would also fit in this category, and to me, that makes way more sense for Edmonton. Ceci has been pretty brutal this year, as he usually is. To me, Kulak is just a more smart defensive D. I think Ceci makes a lot more sense to deal. Now, for the Florida Panthers, the pick is Nick Cousins, which is interesting because he's been pretty bad for Florida, but obviously brings a rough and tumble game and some very dirty hits almost every single game that the Florida Panthers obviously do still value. I'm not really sure how likely of a deal Nick Cousins is to actually happen, but for Florida, we've seen how they might want to go after a Noah Hanifin, how they might want to upgrade on that middle six position, so maybe Nick Cousins is a part of that, though I don't think he'd be a major piece whatsoever. For the LA Kings, the pick is Arthur Kaliev, and it breaks my heart seeing Kaliev so much in trade rumors, but I think it is pretty likely if we are to see the LA Kings upgrade in a major way that Kaliev will be going the other way just because of the lack of ice time this year, and I think still how valuable of a piece he can be. He's put up some pretty strong defensive results in his young career, and obviously we know the offense and the shooting ability that he does have. I still think he could be a really interesting middle six power play option for a lot of teams out there, and I think they should be calling on Kaliev. Make it happen, get him into a team that can actually put him in the right position. Now for the Minnesota Wild, he ends up mentioning Marc-Andre Fleury, which we also mentioned in the players that could be dealt video. Now Minnesota has been playing a lot better as of late, so maybe that is something that doesn't end up happening, but I still think for Fleury, even though he has a no trade clause, this is something that for Minnesota, if they want to bring him to a true contender, could absolutely make happen. He talks about teams like Colorado, LA, Edmonton that might not need a starter, but you could use a safety net. I think especially Colorado makes a lot of sense here if Minnesota's willing to trade within the division. For the Montreal Canadiens, their pick is another goaltender here in Jake Allen, and I actually disagree with this. I think David Savard is the more likely guy for Montreal to shop and to get actual value for. I think Jake Allen and his unsteadiness this season has kind of turned people away from him, especially considering the term that he still has, and I think that might just gatekeep a deal from happening in the end. Kent Hughes has said how rough the goalie market is right now, and I think that might affect Allen's stock. Going on to another goaltender here, though, in UC Saros and the Nashville Predators, who will not be affected by said stock. If he is to be dealt, it would be absolutely insane. And with him, he also mentions how Nashville has a long-term replacement waiting in the wings in Askarov. To me personally, I still am kind of uneasy about Nashville just trading Saros and not getting another goaltender back. I think you could have a tandem of Lincoln and Askarov now, but it's kind of asking a lot of both goaltenders. That's why I do like the New Jersey fit so much, as you could get Vanacek back, who is not good, but could be a stopgap in the case of Askarov, but we'll see what ends up happening. Speaking of New Jersey, the pick is actually Ondrej Palat, which is a fascinating one. The Devils have made quite a few big moves over the past few years, including the free agent edition of Palat. The earlier returns have been mixed, though. 16 goals in 93 games. Palat's getting into his mid-30s, how he's an alternate captain. More than the Devils have been able to get from Palat and likely are in the future. That should make him a candidate to potentially ship around. The big obstacle here is he has a no-movement clause in his contract, with the Devils having a major need for a goalie and several unrestricted free agents on the roster, including Toffoli and a handful of D-men. They're going to need some cap space. Even though I think Vanacek, if we're talking about a goalie deal, is obviously a lot more likely to be dealt, I actually like this quite a bit. For the Devils, they might try to seek a Palat deal, even if there is some leadership there. $6 million from this point is just rough. 8 goals in the year. It's just unjustifiable. Going on to the New York Islanders, Brock Nelson. Adam says how the Islanders are stuck in neutral and it's time to start thinking about the future. It might be painful for Islanders fans, but Brock Nelson is the best trade piece they have given his production and the fact that he has a very manageable contract for the end of the season. The Islanders aren't winning with a 32-year-old now, and they probably won't want to commit to a long-term contract when he's in his mid-30s. At least they probably won't want to do that because he's probably not going to contain that mid-30s goal pace for many more years. This one is fascinating and honestly pretty bold. To me, it is not likely at all, but again, this is just an article on players they should be looking to trade, and in Nelson's case, he's been one of the most underrated players over the past few years, especially in goal scoring. 37 goals, 36 goals, and on pace for around the same range this year as well. He would get a pretty massive haul, I'm willing to bet, and for the Islanders, if they want to jump ship, if they want to restart here, it could be an interesting opportunity, though considering Lou Lamoriello, I just don't see that happening. Do you think the Islanders should trade Brock Nelson? This one is maybe the most wild one of the bunch so far. For the New York Rangers, he mentions Barclay Goodrow, and I could not agree more. Goodrow is just an anchor with his contract, and even though he does bring obviously playoff experience and a lot of leadership there, the dude is just an anchor with how much he makes and just not good enough. $3.6 million for Barclay Goodrow is just awful, and even though it would be an impossible task to trade him, the Rangers should definitely be looking to do so. For the Senators, the obvious choice is Vladimir Tarasenko, and that's who's on this. Again, timing to sell with the contract he has, even though Tarasenko has said recently how he's liked it in Ottawa. The Sens should get as much value back, and if it's going to get a first-round pick back, it's a no-brainer. For the Flyers, Adam had a ton of choices. He ends up selecting Sean Walker, which I agree with as maybe the most likely guy to deal. You could have put a player like Nick Seeler, Scott Laughton in here as well, a lot of different options, but as we know, Sean Walker is likely to be dealt, and he will be dealt over the next month. That's almost a guarantee. Next over the Penguins is Jay Guentzel, another one that is interesting considering the Penguins slide. I thought maybe a week ago that it would be pretty unlikely that we actually see Guentzel traded, but again, with how bad Pittsburgh has been as of late, how much they're sliding, Guentzel might become even more likely to be dealt again at this deadline. I would not be surprised to see it. He talks about how the Claude Giroux deal has been a little bit of a comparable, and Pittsburgh has said as much, wanting the same amount of trade back, and it'd be a pretty good haul if they're able to get a tip it and a first-round pick type of offer back. That would be huge for them. For the San Jose Sharks, it mentions Anthony Duclair as a interesting piece, and again, as a speedy middle sixer, I think Duclair could be pretty interesting. San Jose just has a lot of these same type of players in the same range where it's pretty much mid, but a lot of guys that could get maybe an okay haul back. Duclair, in my opinion, might be the best player available if Ferraro isn't going to be a guy they deal. With Seattle, we got another pretty obvious one in Jordan Eberle, a guy that we talked about potentially getting a first-round pick at this year's deadline. For Seattle, I still think this is a guy that can bring a lot of good scoring punch, even if that goal scoring hasn't been there this season. But I think, again, a nice little change of scenery could be good for him. And even though he is on the older side of things at 34 years old next season, it's going to be okay this year. I think he'll be a solid playoff performer and a guy that you'll want to have on your top 6. With St. Louis, it's Pavel Buchnevich, which is not a surprise. We talked about it as a bit of a headliner in that 15 players that should be dealt at the deadline, a video a few days ago. But with Buchnevich, it's interesting. I would prefer a player like a Torrey Krug or Colin Parayko in this spot, but also considering how much trade protection there is there, they might not want to leave St. Louis. Torrey Krug already denied a trade at last year's offseason. And to St. Louis, Buchnevich might be the most likely to go and probably the easiest to let go of as well, and would get a pretty big haul back. And also considering St. Louis' history of trading players, even though they're in playoff positions, Buchnevich could be the guy to go here. No, he ends up mentioning for Tampa Bay Erik Cernak, which is interesting. He admits that with Mikhail Sergachev out for the year, might not be the most realistic option, but the Lightning might have some incentive to shop him before July 1st when his no trade clause kicks in. It's not that Cernak is a bad player, but the Lightning are going to need a way to find a way to shed that salary, with Steven Stamkos being an unrestricted free agent as well, potentially trading Cernak. Now, as he mentions, there's no way that the Lightning end up trading Cernak at this stage. Should they trade him? I'm not quite sure either. If they're going to trade for another D, maybe so. But for Tampa, there might be a lot of turnover here that we aren't expecting. But I think Cernak should be a guy that still stays in the end. For the Leafs, his pick is Nick Robertson, and we've talked about him a lot as well as a potential trade option. It makes just so much sense considering his role with Toronto, how much he hasn't really played this year for them, and also just how likely he is to be a guy that ends up getting dealt. Especially for Toronto, it seems like they don't want to trade their first rounder this year. Robertson would likely be one of the bigger trade pieces going back if they are to bring in a big rental on the defense or at forward. Now, this one I adamantly disagree with completely. And for the Vancouver Canucks, he mentions Connor Garland here. He says how Garland's name has been mentioned in trade speculation for what seems like an eternity at this point, so let's add it for another year. The Canucks have one of the best offenses of the season, but the 27-year-old could be expendable. He has nice production, but he only plays 13 minutes a night and counts more than $5 million for the cap of the next 2 seasons. That's going to be a lot of money for a role player who is an essential part of the roster. Now, I agree with some of those points, although the production isn't incredible. He's a part of the best third line in hockey right now, and there is no chance that the Canucks will trade him or should trade him. You've gone already all in, and especially at this year's deadline, there's no reason to break that up. Zero reason at all. It would be a disservice to that team to get rid of Garland, who's been one of the best forecheckers and one of quietly the best players on the Canucks this season. Sure, the production has been great, but the intensity he's brought has been instrumental to Vancouver's success. He is a Rick Tocchet player through and through, and I don't care if it's a little bit too much for him. He's good and will continue to be so for Vancouver. Absolute no deal here. Now, he ends up mentioning for Vegas Chandler Stevenson, which is a fascinating one considering how good he has been for the Golden Knights over the past couple of years. His play has taken a step backward this season, which I do agree with, and he is a pending unrestricted free agent. The 29-year-old may not want to be a player Vegas wants to keep beyond this year. Now, again, this is another situation where it's about will or should. To me, I don't think Vegas will trade him, and I don't think they should trade him. Vegas is still in a position to win, and unless they somehow find an upgrade on Chandler Stevenson at this stage, which I don't know is all that likely, I don't think this is a guy they should deal. As much as it pains me, if Vegas is going to make some big deals at this deadline, especially with Jack Eichel on LTIR, it's going to include younger players like a Pavel Dorofeyev or potentially a Kaden Korczak on the roster as well. Definitely not a Chandler Stevenson. There's no way that ends up happening. For the Washington Capitals, he mentions Nick Dowd, which is looking to be one of the better center options available at this deadline as a defensive face-off guy. And as he mentions, he's not a household name, but for Washington, it makes a lot of sense they would trade him, and they might actually get a pretty good haul for him, at least a second-round pick it's looking like, which you make that deal every single day of the week. And then last but not least, at 32, the Winnipeg Jets, he talks about Logan Stanley not living to the hype as a 2016 first-round pick for them, playing in just 10 games this year for the Jets. They don't have to trade him, but they probably want to bring back a major return, most likely another team's version of him that also needs a fresh start, but he doesn't seem to have a long-term future in Winnipeg. And I actually agree with this. With Logan Stanley, he just has proved to be not good. I don't know why any team would trade for him. He's just big, and that's really all he has going for him. He's just not good, and I don't understand why any team would want to trade for him besides that size. But still, for Winnipeg, if they're wanting to make another addition at this deadline, maybe Stanley is a part of a deal like that, but we'll see what ends up happening. For Winnipeg, they got a lot of interesting options, even with the Sean Monahan deal already, but Stanley could be the biggest one among them. Literally the biggest one among them. But I'm going to put the full article in the description so you guys can send some love over to Adam and make sure you guys read it all for all the explanations and everything. But those are his 32 players that will and should be shopped at the deadline this year. I want to know in the comments down below, what did you guys agree? What did you guys disagree with? To me, I had some disagreements, but overall, I had a lot of agreements on this list as well. I thought it was pretty solid and made some pretty good points with some, especially some of the more contentious ones too. I mean, that Brock Nelson one is still making me think right now. But let me know in the comments down below what you guys thought about it. And of course, hit that like button, hit that subscribe button, hit that notification bell if you haven't already, and share the video with all the hockey fans you guys know online to see who they could end up shopping at the deadline this year. And click on this card for all my trade content right in one playlist. My name is Nathan, and I will see you in the next one. Have a great hockey day, and goodbye.